I want to give an enormous welcome for the second time at our webinars to Gus John. We're all in a strange and rather difficult time. Perhaps like so many of us, Gus, that you feel tired, tired physically and emotionally. And here is yet another, in terms of Gaza, apparently endless struggle for the most basic elements of justice. This time, the right to life, let alone freedom for the Palestinian people. And so here we are witnessing another form of racism, of othering, so that, you know, for example, we hear Israelis are killed by Hamas, because you can't say Hamas, you have to say Hamas, but miraculously Palestinians die under Israeli missiles. And I'm aware as a Jewish person and co-chair of a Jewish organization that we rightly expect people to understand the fear and indeed the anger that Jewish people feel at what happened on October the 7th, and that that's an intergenerational fear. And yet we are not supposed to understand the fear and anger that Palestinian people feel, and quite possibly also that Black people feel. So that we have a situation where Palestinians certainly can be rendered as subhuman by not taking any account of their experiences. And the fight against Black racism, anti-Black racism, and the importance of recognizing all the way in which it morphs, all the forms, continues. So for those of you who don't know, Professor Gus John, I think we did put this in the biography we sent out, has been at the forefront of the fight for racial equality and for social justice for many decades, probably more than he wishes to recall, and hasn't given up yet and hasn't stopped working. His work is mainly based in education, most initially probably best known for bringing to our knowledge the misapplication of the term educationally subnormal being applied to young Caribbean children, especially boys, and that was back in the 1970s. But Professor John, as we will hear, makes strong links with other struggles for justice. And today, the main focus of his talk will be his work in writing the book, Don't Salvage the Empire Windrush. Sorry, I've just noticed the message from Rona that she can't hear. See if we can sort something out. If Daniel can help you with that, Rona, we'll try, and if the captions helps. So as I said, with Gus, today's main focus will be his work on writing the book, Don't Salvage the Empire Windrush. And I'll leave it to him, and it's going to speak for just over half an hour to outline his themes, what he's found, why it matters still, and to make whatever connections he chooses. Over to you.
Leah, thank you very much. Colleagues, good evening. It's good to be with you again. As Leah was saying, this is a very difficult time for all of us. And yes, I do feel emotionally exhausted from frustration, perhaps more than anything else, frustrated at the way this conflict is being reported in the international media, not just the British media, and the refusal of people to see just how unbalanced and biased and problematic the recording and reporting of events actually are. It is terribly frustrating. I mean, last night, for example, I was listening to the BBC reporting on the Israeli hostages that had been released. And one can clearly empathize with all of those families who were anxious about the welfare of their loved ones and so on. But it's the language, when one analyzes the language, as you were suggesting, Leah, that it is particularly troubling. For me, who have been concerned for years about these administrative detentions and imprisonment and what have you, which put me very much in mind of Guantanamo Bay, and the fact that people don't particularly know what they're charged with, how long they would be detained, and their relatives suffer year after year after year, not knowing whether they would ever be released, or whether, having already served a period of imprisonment without trial, they would then be imprisoned by courts. And what I couldn't understand is why we have such a partial view of human suffering and the denial of rights to individuals. And looking back in history, particularly at the history of African people and colonialism and imperialism, including enslavement, it seems to me that one gets to that mindset, to that extreme position of othering and excluding others from human consciousness, only if you determine that they are genetically inferior to you, that they are not quite as human as the rest of us, and that we have a right to dictate whether they live or whether they die, whether they have freedom or not, and so on. So I have to tell you, although we planned this event long before October the 7th, since October the 7th, I've been so preoccupied with the daily occurrences around Hamas and the Israeli the response of the Israeli state. Let me make that clear. I'm talking about the state. That my book really pales into insignificance in the light of what we are bombarded with daily, which tug at our heartstrings. So I just want to make some connections. The Windrush story started in 1948. That's when this boat called the Empire Windrush left the Caribbean. It went around the coast of America to Mexico, picked up some Polish citizens, swung back and went round the Caribbean, found that it had 1,020 empty berths because it had been used principally to return to the Caribbean members of the West India Regiment who had come to Britain to assist in the Second World War. And having returned them, it went trying to pick up people to come back to Europe. In Jamaica, it put out an advertisement saying that we've got loads of empty space. If you want to travel to the United Kingdom, you can buy a berth for £28. So some people sold their animals, they borrowed money from their relatives, they looked under the mattress and found whatever they could, and then they paid the £28 to come to Britain. So what made them do that? What made them do that was the fact that they were living principally in penury. After abolition, the people who were the enslavers, the plantation owners, the owners of enslaved Africans, were compensated to the tune of 20 million pounds then, which runs into billions of pounds now, trillions indeed. And they were compensated for the loss of property. In other words, since they owned the enslaved Africans whom they had bought at slave markets, and since those were used as chattels to make them lots of money, they wanted compensation both for every head of a slave that they had, but also in terms of the earnings that they might have had if slavery had not been abolished. And with that money, they came back to Britain and started all sorts of developments. It funded the Industrial Revolution. It funded the expansion of railways. It funded the buildings of lots of what we now know as country houses and these marvelous institutions cared for by English heritage, and so on. Meanwhile, the people who had been enslaved received nothing in recompense for all the years that they had suffered. They were not apportioned parcels of land from these large estates that these slave owners owned. They had appropriated them. And that's my first connection I want to make between this story and the Palestine, West Bank, Gaza story. Because our experience is of colonialism and imperialism displacing indigenous populations, people who had lived in those lands for centuries. They had an ancestral legacy and an ancestral right to those lands. They were exterminated. Arawaks, Caribs, Amerindians, in order that Britain particularly, and indeed France and Germany in other parts apart from the Caribbean, could use those lands for the expansion of mercantile capitalism. In other words, it was a form of, it was genocide. All empires expand through barbarism. The Ottoman Empire, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, they all expand through barbarism. And that barbarism takes the form of genocide, of ethnic cleansing, of the total displacement of people from their ancestral lands. And so when Balfour and all of that lot got together to determine what should happen to the land occupied for generations by Palestinians, they had form. They had already been part of a systemic structure of displacement, extermination of peoples, and the rest of it. And they justified that extermination by suggesting that those people were not totally human. The only people who were human were white Europeans. So my African ancestors were considered to be only 3/5 human, others partially human to what extent they determined. And therefore, it in their view justified the savagery, the brutality, the barbarism. In other words, you can't apply common human values to all of those people because they are not quite like us. Now, we do not have to have any great stretch of the imagination to remember what Aryanism was about, to remember what eugenics was about, to remember why Adolf Hitler and the SS and the Third Reich and all of those people conducted all of those experiments during that period on people's skulls, on the size of their brains, on all sorts of stuff. So my point is that there is a clear line running through history of the way in which colonizers and imperialists in the expression and growth of white supremacy have indulged in those types of genocide and barbarism while justifying their actions by dehumanizing others. And I believe that is a very clear and direct connection to be made, because as I see it, it's part and parcel of the same system, process, structure. When one looks at an old original map of Palestine and see what is actually left of that strip called Gaza, on the other side, the West Bank, and the way in which those people were forcibly displaced in order that the state of Israel might be established, one begins to see how that whole thing worked. And additionally, what actually happened to Palestinians when they were thus displaced and pushed further and further to the margins. One of the things that I can't fully understand is how people who lived with that desecration, human desecration, for all of those years, and who did not complain about the fact that women and children were being imprisoned and kept in prison until they became adults under all kinds of horrid conditions, could now be appealing to our moral sensibilities about the suffering of Israeli hostages and those awful people, Hamas, and the way they have turned morality on its head through the barbarism and atrocities that they indulged in. Okay, so back to the story about the Windrush. The descendants of those enslaved Africans, including my own parents, my great-grandfather was an enslaved African from West Africa. My father remembered his grandfather, proud, strong man, but broken and longing to get back to his roots. He has suffered, as the rest of them, erasure not only of their essential humanity, but of all the things that kept them going, their religious beliefs, the spiritual traditions, their acknowledgement and homage to ancestors. All of that was swept away, superimposed by Christianity, who then decided to punish those Africans who continue to practice their traditions and hold on to their religious beliefs. So one of the reasons why I refer to the Windrush narrative as a colonial, backward, and ahistorical narrative is that those who propound these theories about people on the Windrush coming here to help Britain rebuild itself after 2 devastating world wars within 30 years make no mention whatsoever of the fact that, continuing from the end of enslavement, Britain, as the colonial ruler of those places, had built a huge reserve pool of labor. People in the main did not have jobs. Their work was mainly on plantations and in animal husbandry and so on and so forth. My father was totally illiterate and remained so till he passed on, because his mother had 5 children. She couldn't take care of them all. They lived in extreme poverty. And she decided to hand him over to his godmother for her to rear him and bring him up. She was a budding entrepreneur. She ran a bakery that supplied bread to the villages round about them. And she had him and about 9 other children, boys, going into the forest every day to gather wood so that she can heat up her ovens to bake bread and cakes and so on and so forth. So he never saw the inside of a classroom, nor was he taught outside of school. And that was true of so many of people of his generation. So I grew up in a village of about 200 people, and 85% of the adults in that village were functionally illiterate, including my father. My mother was just slightly better off. And it is from all of those economic conditions that people decided to come to Britain. And they came because they wanted a better life for themselves, to which they were perfectly entitled. But they also thought that their children would have a better chance of social mobility and career advancement if they could come and partake of the excellent superior education we were told they could get in Britain. And that was true of my parents. Okay, I came after, thankfully, after I had finished my schooling. I came at the age of 19 to study theology in Oxford and become a Blackfriar, both by name and pigmentation. I joined the English Dominican order. But many of those people who came did menial jobs. My father worked as a janitor, as they call them, at an American air base in West Ruislip in West London. My mother mopped hospital floors and handed out teas to people throughout the time that she was in this country. And they went back to Grenada earlier than most other returners, because in 1971, my father was nearly killed by some neo-fascists. Coming from work one day, he did night shifts, coming home after his 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift. He was set upon by 6 racists armed with baseball bats and bicycle chains and things, who beat him to a pulp. And the only reason why he survived was because he had the good sense to run up somebody's path to their door, pick up a bottle of milk that some milk float had recently delivered, broke it, and cut off the ear of one of his assailants. And he nearly cut his jugular. So his friends grabbed him up, bleeding, and ran off. My father, meanwhile, struggled to come home, got to the front door and collapsed. To our horror, I remember I was something like 22 or 23 at the time, going to help my mother drag this man into the house. And we had to stem his bleeding and put tourniquets all around him and so on and so forth, and then get him to hospital. When I suggested to my mother that we should call the police and tell them about this racist attack, she insisted that I should do no such thing, which I couldn't understand. And then she explained to me that because he'd cut off this man's ear, if we called the police, my father was likely to be arrested for grievous bodily harm and thrown in jail, even if those thugs nearly killed him. So we didn't call the police. She called the staff at the hospital where she worked. The ambulance came, they took him there, and they took very good care of him. But within less than a year of him overcoming that horror, he and my mother had packed up and returned to Grenada. They were among the first returners of that generation to go back to the country from which they had come. And he said, the last thing he said to me as he left Heathrow Airport was, take care of yourself and don't think you've got to spend your time in this wretched place. He said, I would sooner go back and die of poverty in Grenada than be killed in England by white racists. Okay. So with all of that as a backcloth, I cannot for the life of me understand why those people who propound these Windrush theories cannot make a connection between the fact that Britain left the Caribbean denuded, impoverished, dispossessed, and came and rebuilt Britain with the wealth that was made there. And yet they could be talking about coming to rebuild the mother country, as if the mother country had delivered its own debt to them. But what is even worse is that they made no connection between the fact that this boat that brought them here, which everybody was celebrating, to the extent that even now there is a GoFundMe campaign out to raise something like 2.5 million pounds, my friends. 2.5 million to send deep sea divers into the Mediterranean. They've already located where that ship is lying on the seabed, to go and extract the anchor of the Empire Windrush, bring it back to shore, and refashion it, remaster it, whatever, spruce it up so that it could be held as a monument to the Caribbean contribution to Britain after the Second World War. Now the question is, how deluded can you get? Okay. But what they haven't told us is this, that that ship has not always been called the Empire Windrush. It was the Monte Rosa, owned by a German fleet, which was commandeered by the Nazis during the Second World War to round up Jews. Okay, it was a troop carrier, but what it also did was to round up Jews from Norway, from other parts of Europe, and take them back to Germany, there to be put on these long trains to places like Auschwitz. They were the carriers of people who eventually ended up in Hitler's death camps. Now, that part of the story is never ever told. So when the war finished and Britain decided to take its spoils of war, it appropriated some of those ships, and that particular one, the Monte Rosa, they decided to rename the Empire Windrush. Windrush is a river in the Cotswolds. And they gave that name, God knows what the people of Windrush did to deserve this. They gave that name, the name of that river, to that former Nazi troop ship and renamed it the Empire Windrush. And you know, as I wrote in I think in that book, that it would be rather peculiar if the people who telling this Windrush story were to determine that the slave ships that brought enslaved Africans from the coast of West Africa to the Caribbean should be reclaimed and celebrated in the way that the Empire Windrush has been celebrated. But that's one part of the story. The second part of the story, of course, is that those who came were not the first people of African descent to land in Britain. People had been coming to this country at least since the 16th century, and even earlier. Hadrian's Wall, the Roman Empire had many African people as generals and other senior officers within its troops. But then amongst those who came, there were those who had relatives who had fought in the First World War and had settled in Britain rather than coming back to the Caribbean. And they could have been found in Cardiff, Tiger Bay, Butte Town, just around the corner from where I currently live, in Liverpool, in South Shields and Tyneside, in Bristol, and in East London. And those settled communities that gave rise to a large and growing mixed heritage population were made up of ex-service personnel, principally men, but also some women, and of merchant seamen. Because even before the First World War, merchant seamen had been coming in and out of the British Isles, working on ships, involved in trade, and staying ashore in many cases. And there are people in Liverpool, for example, and indeed in Cardiff, who could trace their lineage back to those merchant seamen from West Africa, East Africa, North Africa. So the idea that somehow or other those 500 or so people who came on the Windrush were the first group of people to form a Black British presence is historically nonsensical. But even if it were the case, the fact of the matter is that nothing in the Windrush narrative acknowledges the fact that in that same period, between the 50s and the middle of the second decade of the millennium, Britain had growing numbers of people from South Asia coming to live here. And that's even before you take account of the Kenyan Asian crisis and the Ugandan Asian crisis triggered by Idi Amin. People came, and they came with the same affiliations as Africans, because Britain had also been an empire in India. And all of that South Asian area, people had the same passports as we did in the Caribbean, entitling us as citizens of the United Kingdom and its colonies to come to Britain. And everybody knows, anybody with eyes to see would know, that South Asian population, Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, Indians, occupying different parts of the labor market, have had a much bigger footprint, economic footprint in this country than people from the Caribbean. And whether it be corner shops, warehouses, garment factories, whatever, the South Asian population have made a bigger contribution to the British economy over the last 4 decades than Caribbean people have. So the notion that you can attribute to Caribbean people the historical responsibility for rebuilding modern Britain is a nonsense. And it seems to me that one of the reasons why the British state has been so eager to embrace this Windrush narrative, embellish it, and run with it, is because it detracts attention from the brutality with which they've dealt with people of that same generation. The Windrush scandal, as it came to be known, came about because Theresa May and David Cameron determined that they needed to demonstrate to Britain, to the electorate, that they could be as tough on immigration as Nigel Farage and UKIP. So in 2013, Theresa May had vans running around London with hoardings on either side, billboards on either side. Emblazoned on those billboards were messages such as "Go home or face arrest." Now, that was allegedly targeted at illegal immigrants. But then neither the police nor Tommy Robinson and his useless, hopeless, nasty neo-Nazi friends could tell the difference between an illegal immigrant and me. How do you set about going about people going about their business, and you could identify this person as being illegal, whatever that might mean, and that person not? So it wasn't surprising when, after those vans had started parading the streets and the Daily Mail, etc., had the field day with all of that, Black people who had been settled here for years and their children started getting harassed by the far right. Because as far as they were concerned, we were all illegal immigrants.
Gus, can I just say sorry, but can you be thinking about
how much more time have I got?
Well, you've been more than 35 minutes, so just as soon as you can.
So let me just wind this up by saying this. Perhaps the most vile thing and the most disturbing thing that we have had to witness as the Black presence in this country in the last period has been the rise of the Asian far right in government. Sunak, Patel, Javid, Braverman, and of course, Badenoch and that lot. I never thought the day would come when Black people would be running the British state and being more vile and anti-Black than the white counterparts who went before them. And there's something particularly dangerous about that, it seems to me, especially given what's going on with the right across Europe. So my parting shot is this, that really, if we are going to have a future in this country that is not defined by conflict and violence, we need to ensure that all our institutions, particularly schools and universities, enable young people to work across divides of race and ethnicity, of religion, of sexuality, and equip themselves to building a future that is equitable, that has the hallmark of social justice, and that does not confine another generation to what we are seeing just now because of the fractures that there are in society based upon those divisions. And I have a genuine belief that if you can find peace after war and genocide and whatever, you must be able to find peace before. And that peace must be built on a foundation of justice and of human rights. Thank you.